Now let's talk about how the exception proves the rule. As I mentioned, many species are polygamous, where the male is able to mate with many different females, and the female spends more of her time and energy investment in raising the offspring. However, there are some bird species and some mammalian species where the male and female contributions to the offspring are almost the same. This is also studied widely and understood in the waved albatross. I was able to observe this species engage in its mating behaviors when I was on the Galapagos Islands about 10 years ago. One of the things you can see from these pictures is that there is no visible difference between the male and the female of the species. This is one of the many indicators that these two sexes are fairly equivalent in this species. The albatross are seabirds in the Pacific and spend much of their time soaring above the oceans. They are also a monogamous species. Once they choose a partner, they tend to mate with only that partner and often will return to the same partner year after year. Not only that, but both parents play a role in the care of and rearing of the egg and hatchling. That's because where these birds mate, the Galapagos Islands, is far away from any other land source. And the food available around the oceans in these areas is minimal. Both parents tend to lose a lot of their body weight and spend much of their time simply providing for enough food for a single hatchling. It requires the investment of both parents to get a single hatchling to survive. The behaviors that you'll watch in the waved albatross video that I will post on Canvas will show you that the ritualistic dancing is actually done by both sexes. The male and female often mirror each other's behavior and include staring with their bills open, clacking, where they almost look like they're dueling or possibly even kissing with their beaks, and calling out at each other. Partners are often chosen after a long courtship and ritualistic dancing for each other, and the males are just as choosy as females. Again, this is very likely because the time and energy investment provided by each sex is fairly equivalent. This lesson is even learned to the extreme when we take a look at seahorses. One of the few things people know about seahorses is often that seahorses are unusual and that the male is the one responsible for carrying the baby. The male is what you see over here on the right-hand side of the image. He is there caring for and even housing the developing babies as they grow bigger. If he's the one that houses and cares for the babies as they grow up, what makes him the male? The reason why we refer to that particular seahorse as the male is because of the gametes or sex cells he produces. He produces the smaller of the two sex cells, the sperm, whereas the female produces the eggs. But what's interesting is that she transfers the eggs to the male, and the male is the one responsible for caring for and nurturing the offspring. So her time and energy investment is actually less than his. As a result, one of the things that we see in seahorses is an exact mirror or opposite of what we see in most animal species. That the males of seahorses are in fact the choosier, and the females have to dance and compete to mate with the male. Understanding the difference between polygamy and monogamy in these organisms is very insightful. It helps us understand different animal behaviors. Scientists, as a result, have taken an even closer look at this polygamy versus monogamy question in order to better understand what makes a species polygamous or monogamous. One of the most widely studied of these is the prairie vole and the meadow vole. Polygamous species are the ones that engage in sexual behavior where the males mate with as many females as possible. The meadow vole is the polygamous species of these two. Monogamous species are ones in which partners will mate for at least one mating season. The prairie vole is a monogamous species. These two vole species, which as you can see look very similar to mice, are in fact very similar to each other. Prairie voles and meadow voles are both found in the Midwest United States. However, they are a different species and will not mate with each other. What makes the meadow vole polygamous while the prairie vole is monogamous? It turns out that after some scientific study, scientists have discovered that they differ in their brain chemistry. There's something about their brains that are substantially different from each other. Specifically, there are receptors in their brains for a molecule called vasopressin. Vasopressin is a neurotransmitter released in the brains of mammals after they have sex. Now, while vasopressin is released in all mammals after sex, not all mammals have brain tissue that can sense the vasopressin. The prairie voles have a special receptor or molecule in their brain cells that allow them to detect the vasopressin and as a result generate a feeling of reward and happiness every time they spend more time with their partner. However, the meadow voles do not have this receptor in their brain and as a result cannot detect the presence of vasopressin when it's released after sex. The meadow voles then receive no feeling of reward or happiness when they see or spend time with their sexual partner again in the future. What's interesting about the prairie vole and vasopressin is that the more frequently those two partners mate, the stronger the connection forms between the two of them, strengthening their monogamy. We'll talk a little bit more about this vasopressin receptor and how it functions in humans when we get to the biology of love lecture. In the meantime, we'll segue into our last lecture for this section, that on sibling rivalry. And as you can see, we'll have a video on prairie vole interactions as well as on sibling rivalry on the Canvas website. All animals compete for food and other available resources. But one of the things that's been widely studied is competition within a family. It turns out that competition between siblings can be even stronger than competition between two organisms of the same species that are not related. The most likely reason for this is that siblings have to share the limited resources provided by their parents. And those limited resources are the only thing keeping the siblings alive. The more one sibling can acquire those resources, the more likely it is to survive. Sibling rivalry is seen in many species. You may even consider that you might have engaged in some sibling rivalry when you were younger. But in some animals, it ends up being extremely severe. And it can in fact result in the death of one sibling by another in a phenomenon known as siblicide. This is especially common in the rivalry seen between siblings of birds sharing a nest. Many species of birds will intentionally push weaker siblings out of the nest, resulting in the death of their weaker siblings. This is seen in the Nazca booby, again, a bird species found on the Galapagos Islands. One of the reasons why the Galapagos Islands has such widely studied behavior is again related to the fact that the resources on these islands are limited. And as a result of these limited resources, the sibling rivalry can get quite extreme. The Nazca boobies, as you can see from these pictures, do not build nests in trees. Primarily that's because the Galapagos Islands lack a lot of tree biodiversity. Instead, most of the Nazca boobies lay their eggs on the ground. This is also satisfactory because there's not many predators on the Galapagos Islands, or at least historically there weren't before human interaction. Nazca boobies tend to lay 2 eggs on the ground. One egg, the first egg to be laid, will often be the first one to hatch. That chick is then usually 1 day older than its sibling. Being 1 day older may not seem like a lot, but in the growth spurt of chicks, specifically of the Nazca boobies, this can result in a much stronger, much larger sibling. The larger sibling will then, when the younger sibling hatches, push the younger sibling out of the area of dirt where the parent comes to feed their chicks. The parent will literally feed the one chick that remains in the dirt patch or the nesting area, ignoring the younger sibling that has been pushed out of that area. This is quite traumatic to see if you were to ever visit the Galapagos Islands, to witness a parent feeding one of its offspring while watching its youngest offspring cry out for help and food and not respond. Why do the Nazca boobies lay 2 eggs? This is likely, an insurance policy, so that if one of the eggs were to be damaged or destroyed for any reason, they have another egg that will ensure at least some reproductive fitness for that year. It's also entirely possible that laying 2 eggs is a relic of when there was more food available to the Nazca boobies on the Galapagos Islands or elsewhere, and that they still have not evolved the advantage of just laying 1 egg. If it remains an advantage to lay 2 eggs and remains a good insurance policy, the Nazca boobies will continue to lay 2 eggs in years to come. On the other hand, if this is simply an evolutionary relic, we are likely to see the Nazca boobies eventually evolve to where the females will just lay 1 egg. This is less of a toll on the female and will be an advantage for generations to come. However, this kind of change in brood size, or the number of eggs being laid in a nest, takes some time and may not be seen for thousands of years. Well, that's it for our animal behavior lecture. I would encourage you to watch the additional videos accompanying this lecture, primarily because they're entertaining, but also they can be informative, reinforcing some of the information we learned in this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.